All right, my team, we are continuing. We are continuing our section in philosophy. We are on page 406 in this edition of the Ever-Present Origin. I am having a blast, and I hope you guys are too. So last week we did time in philosophy, and now we are moving on to point number 2, I believe, which is the admission of the inadequacy of rational thought. Now, unfortunately, I don't know if unfortunately is the right word, but if you've watched some of my other videos, particularly my maybe Seeing the World Integrally video series, or maybe the Kill Rationals about quantum logic, quantum mechanics, and transcending rational. You might have heard some of this before, so I apologize if I'm a little repetitive, but I'm assuming that not everyone watches all my stuff, which is probably, I think, a safe bet for your own sanity. So we're going to get a little repetitive. I do apologize. What else? I love you guys. Let's get into it. As to number 2, the admission of the inadequacy of rational thought is expressed in various ways, even in the philosophical movement bearing the imprint of the eidetic sciences. F. Gonseth, like Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher, has designated this movement as a new quote-unquote open philosophy. Its foundations lie in those sciences based on closed eidetic thinking. E.R. Janisch, Jaensch, I apologize, has decisively contributed to the natural sciences, and the Gonseth Circle, with its publication Dialectica, edited by Gonseth, P. Bernays, and G. Bachelard, is representative of this new scientific philosophy. So it's an open philosophy. I think he explains it later on, but if he doesn't, I'll explain it later. It was at the first meeting of the Circle in Zurich, 1938, where Jean Lukasiewicz, all right, I don't know, developed his multi-valued propositional logic, which was further developed and refined by H. Reichenbach as three-valued logic. It has successfully opened up logic and extended the systemization in philosophy along lines necessitated by the new physics, notably by the indeterminacy of Planck's energy quantum. As an open philosophy, it too attempts to grasp the irrational consequences of the new physics without sacrificing rationality. Yet this attempt breaks up the previous foundations of philosophy, and it will be interesting to follow its further development, which seems secure as long as it takes into account merely physical time. How long that will be possible is another question. Essentially, what Gebser is saying here is that philosophy is superseding itself. Its foundations, by messing with the foundations of logic, you're messing with the foundations of traditional modern rational philosophy. I think it's a necessary change. I'm sure there's going to be some resistance in the philosophical circles. And I have to say, ever since reading Gebser, I've been disagreeing more and more with philosophers. I will say, you guys do the stereotype of you guys claiming a monopoly on truth, even if it's not quite justified. I think I'm starting to realize it's not too bad. Don't get me wrong. It's not like everyone I talk to is like that, but sometimes you guys go a little far. You devalue the other sciences because they don't follow your rational box. Okay. Reichenbach's three-valued logic is based on the indeterminacy principle of the energy quantum discovered and formulated by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. I think that guy sold me some blue stuff before. Reichenbach defines the new logic as follows. Okay, this is important because we all know the traditional logic, especially if you're a philosopher. You know that. Now we're going to do the three-valued logic, and it seems subtle, and it is, but it is a change here. As follows, quote, "The usual logic is two-valued. It is constructed with the aid of the truth values true and false. Yet it is possible to introduce an intermediary truth value that could be designated as indeterminacy, and to apply this truth value to the group of propositions which in the Bohr-Heisenberg interpretation are called meaningless. If we have a third truth value called indeterminacy, then the tertium non datur is no longer the definitive formula. There is the tertium, an intermediary value represented by the logical condition indeterminate." It seems subtle, but even just the addition, instead of true and false, but indeterminacy, which is picking up from, what's his name? Schrodinger's probably is related to that as well. I think it is important because if you actually integrate the indeterminate proposition or aspect or whatever you want to call it. Because a lot of what happens is the rationalists, and we all know if you follow my Kill Rationalism series, a lot of it is lip service. So what they do is if you introduce this in a philosophy course, they'll take it and they'll pay lip service to it and they'll go indeterminacy, okay. But let's focus on the true or false, right? So they pay lip service and they go, no, indeterminacy. Let's say the indeterminacy aspect, part of it, constitutes 60% of what we're analyzing here. They won't actually integrate that 60%. They'll treat the 40% that is determinate as the 100%. So long as you are actually integrating this indeterminacy principle, you're fine. Actually do it. Don't just pay lip service to it like the rationalists do. That's not good. But we can see how traditional logic is already being superseded. No longer is it true or false, but true, false, indeterminate. No longer is it one or the other. Invoke the third aspect of measuring thought. It's a 1, 2, 3. So a simple step. I don't think this is like the end of the world for the rationalists. I think quantum logic is a much better argument against it. Heidegger's The Clearing is a better argument. But I could still use it, still use it. Transcendental logic, which we'll probably get into. So. As we have suggested, this is Gebser, C.F. von Weizsäcker's work on quantum logic may well become the philosophically decisive event of our epoch. So I'm going to explain quantum logic. I do apologize for being a little repetitive. I'm going to use the dryer example just because I've used it before and I think I'm better at it. I'm in my room, I'm writing my essays or doing whatever. I hear a noise from downstairs. Immediately I know it's a dryer, right? The entity itself is a holistic entity immediately, okay? So what happened? How did I know it was a dryer? Why was it not the washer, we'll say? Why was it not, I don't know, like a box in my basement that fell? Why was it not some other giant piece of machinery or equipment? So what happened in that very quick, rapid time span of me hearing the noise and codifying it as a dryer, quantum logic happened. Which is to say, my consciousness rapidly employed a series of yes or no questions, or either or questions, that determined, at the end of the day, that it was a dryer. So the noise could be a dryer, or it could be one of those other things I mentioned. Or more simply, is that a dryer or is the dryer an extension of the floor, right? Is it a dryer or is it a heat source? Is it a dryer or is it a symbol for modernity and technological destruction of man's soul? A series of either or questions. It's either dryer or the symbol. It's either dryer or an extension of the floor, either dryer or extension of the wall. The point is the dryer is being privileged in each one. So when I'm logically thinking about things, I posit the dryer logically. But the mistake, I don't want to say mistake, but there's a hidden quantum element here that relies upon your consciousness. So in theory, how do I know if the dryer is just a dryer or if the dryer is a symbol for modernity, advancement, and technological progression and its corrosive effects on the soul? How do I know which one it is exclusively? Well, rationally, you might say a dryer, but if I'm perceiving it as a symbol, well, then it's no longer exclusively rationally a dryer, now is it? It's now a symbol. So you can say, well, the dryer is both a dryer and a symbol. And it's also an extension of the floor and the wall, and it's also a heat source simultaneously. Okay, that sounds good with me. I agree. So the dryer is all of those things combined simultaneously, which means it belongs to a field of ontological simultaneity, and it's only after our consciousness engages with the object of reflection, and by employing quantum logic, do we choose one or the other. So it's not true that the dryer is a dryer. Now, of course, in a sense, it is necessarily true, because I'm not saying the physical object doesn't exist. That's ridiculous. That's nonsense. I go down to my basement. I put my clothes. I know the physical object is there. Obviously, my senses are doing this for me. That's not the problem. The problem is, does it show up as a holistic entity unto itself, as a dryer, rather than just this empty object that you don't even know what it is? It shows up as a dryer. The laptop I'm recording shows up as a laptop, not just a noise source or a heat source, as a laptop, right? So again, what's the lesson here? One, the dryer is not just a dryer. So the dryer is a symbol, it's a dryer, it's a heat source, it's all those things simultaneously. But we also view it as just a dryer in our normal day-to-day lives. So this means that consciousness, by employing quantum logic, plays the decisive role or the decisive factor in ensuring the ontological validity of a particular object. The tree, if it falls and no one's around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. Now, rationally, that doesn't make sense, because rationally you would say it does make a sound, just no one was around there to hear it. And to an extent, that is correct. But the problem is that's not how human beings operate in the real world. consciousness, if it plays the decisive factor in the ascribing of ontological certainty or whatever you want to call it, well, if the tree falling never comes into my conscious sphere, it doesn't exist. Just like some guy in Brazil, never met him. I know Vinicius Jr., I know Neymar, I know Fernandinho, I know Ronaldinho. I know them because I'm a soccer fan and it's come into my consciousness. But some random dude, Roberto, might as well not even exist. Might as well not even exist. Consciousness plays the decisive factor in all this stuff. There is no human perception devoid of the human, devoid of human consciousness. It's just not how it works. So quantum logic, I think, is a pretty good argument against strict, like purely strict rationalist logic, because all rationalist logic, or rational logic, I should say, relies upon quantum logic, right? Because if I'm rationally considering the dryer, well, of course I had to employ quantum logic for it to be the dryer and not a symbol, say. So hopefully that was clear enough. Here's another important point. So he says, work on quantum logic may well become the philosophically decisive event of our epoch. So what have we done with quantum logic? We've loosened up the bolts of philosophical determinism and certainty on a particular object. This mouse is only a mouse. Well, of course, as quantum logic just made clear, it's not. Does this sound familiar to you? That a female is not a female, or not just a female. A woman is not just a woman. A male is not just a male. The loosening of the rational certainty is the decisive, philosophically decisive event of our epoch. But Gebser, I don't want to say makes a mistake, because postmodernism wasn't really a thing back then, but he does make a mistake in assuming too much good faith in future generations, because he didn't realize Foucault, that moron. By the way, I've heard a lot of my postmodernism was one of the first videos, probably not one of my best, but I still pretty much stand by. I might refine the way I phrase things. I have yet to hear an actual refutation of that video. I've heard a bunch of cope. I heard a bunch of you didn't acknowledge a particular paragraph, so therefore that sounds like a particular power knowledge structure, which is oppressive to me, so I'm not going to accept that. So find another critique. Yeah, see how fun that is? He made a mistake, because if you and I were to argue irrationality, except for rationality, what would we do? We would employ what Gebser has employed. Transcendental logic, which we'll probably get to, three-valued logic, and quantum logic. That is an intellectually honest and valid way of doing that. Social constructionism is ridiculous. I almost want to use a different word beginning with an R, okay? Go watch I'm not going to explain it here. Okay, actually, I will explain it here. I take it back. Watch this. I can refute all the claims that all knowledge is a social construct right here. Ready? I refute it thus. I don't need to think about the table. I don't need to socially abstract about the table. I don't need to talk about the table with anything else. All I need is to know the table exists. If you want to say the word table, the signifier table, is a social construct, fine. But the object itself is not. So drop that shit. This knowledge was channeled to me and carried to me through my automatic, pre-rational, irrational faculties. It has nothing to do with abstract, rational thought or anything like that. And if it doesn't, this entire social construction stuff just complete. Anyways, I wasn't planning on ranting against postmodernism. It's ridiculous. It's nonsense. But that is, I would agree with Gebser in a way, that quantum logic, even though it's not really quantum logic, it's the loosening of rational certainty and through the ridiculous Foucault way of social constructionism, was undeniably, in my opinion, the philosophically decisive event of our epoch. I am open to argument, because there's a lot of smart people. You guys are probably academics. You guys have a better understanding, but it just seems kind of obvious to me. So in a way, Gebser was right. In a way, he was wrong. He was right that, yes, that was the decisive event. He was wrong insofar as he assumed way too much good faith in, like, the postmodernists coming up. It's ridiculous. All right. Let's continue. Werner Heisenberg, its true author, or at least inspirer, remarks that this quote-unquote non-Aristotelian logic is more encompassing than previous endeavors of three-valued logic. Excuse me. And in its results can be compared to quote-unquote non-Euclidean geometry, so more connections between this new form of irrational logic and the irrational way of doing things in math. It opens up possibilities for thought which we urgently need to warrant the new reality. a reality whose coming to awareness was ultimately revealed by the discoveries of nuclear physics. Excuse me. These instances of liberation from the hitherto closed system, there we go, that's a good way of putting it, a liberation from the previously closed systems of rationalism, are highly significant, and we should observe that they were initiated by what we have called the irrational energy quantum, characterized by a temporal intensity value and potential time freedom. Whether incorporation of the quote-unquote third truth value will turn out to be something other than a Trojan horse for philosophy remains to be seen. It kind of was, I guess. The danger is at least imminent in the case of Hans Reichenbach, although C.F. von Weizsäcker will most likely be able to avoid it. In any event, the previous compulsion to systemization has been undone. This in itself is an aperspectival inception with logistic and mathematical philosophy. Let's talk about transcendental logic for a second, because I think I made a mistake describing it in one of my other videos. I can't remember which one. I described it as this sort of almost like this wedding of pre-rational intuition and logic. That's really not what it was. I made a big mistake, so let me try to correct that. Transcendental logic rather than traditional logic. Socrates is a man, all men must breathe, Socrates is a man, Socrates breathes. There you go, right? Or maybe I flipped it. That's traditional logic, but transcendental logic is, the way I understand it at least, is kind of what Kant was getting into. What are the a priori conditions or prerequisites that allow rational perception, judgment, and clarification to even take place? And that seems to be what Kant was doing with his categories, or as I like to call them, filters of space-time and causality, right? So in order for us to engage with logic at all, we have to have these transcendental, which is to say, non-spatial, kind of irrational almost, faculties that allow for logic to even take place. So, kind of like I said, it's about the conditions, the prerequisite conditions needed for logical judgment rather than said logical judgment. And I think in turn, as long as it doesn't come at a negation of logic, I think it actually opens a deeper vista or window into truth, in my personal opinion. So that's transcendental logic. So we have some pretty good arguments against the rationalists, right? We have three-value logic. We have, what was Reichenbach's? Three-value logic, quantum logic, and transcendental logic. You also have things like Heidegger's The Clearing, I think is pretty great. And we also have space-time. We've integrated space-time. No longer is it space and time. So those 5, 6 arguments, I think, are pretty good. All right, let's continue. This might be 3 videos, this section, because I'm spending more time than I thought it would. We still have to get to Heidegger. Okay. The extent of this breakup is evident from a lecture of M. Bentz on the results of the third meeting of the Dialectica Group, 1951. In his words, quote, "Open philosophy is a philosophy without ideological tendencies or the ghost of an absolute," unquote. It works, quote, "with open concepts, is distrustful of an unalterable position, and shuns the prison of fixed concepts." Now, of course, you can always shun the prison of fixed concepts with quantum logic. Don't be a moron when it comes to quantum logic, by the way. If you're on a highway and a car is coming at you, yeah, in theory, the car is not just a car, right? It could be a symbol for modernity's decay, fine. Or it could be a symbol for the boxed in and isolated and separated and violent nature of the world in our contemporary epoch, fine. Okay? If you view the car only as a symbol when you're on the highway and you decide, well, I'm driving an actual car and the cars can run over a symbol any day of the week, guess what's going to happen? You're going to get in an accident, you're going to die, or you're going to kill someone else. So quantum logic is good, but always employ it intelligently, right? Don't be ridiculous. Remember, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to rationality. There is a time and place, just like all the other ones. Rationality has a time and place too. This is quite evidently a rejection of what we have called the perspectival fixity of space-bound conceptuality. Quote-unquote open thinking, as this group calls its mode of realization, is an aperspectival endeavor, and at the same time an admission of the inadequacy of the previous rational mode of realization. All of this has been accomplished. Oh, that's another. We got some more arguments. All of this has been accomplished without reference to psychology, although Karl Jaspers, in his Psychology of Worldviews, and later Carl Jung, have discovered the determining influence of specific psychic attitudes that give each philosophy its decisive stamp. This has demonstrated the subjective aspect of each philosopheme, which has only a limited and sectored objective correctness, a most disquieting finding, which understandably generally evokes emotional reactions. The finding has not only revealed the limits of philosophy, limits are always spatially determined, but has also weakened the claim by philosophy of universal validity and objectivity. So unfortunately, the demonstration of the of the psyche as the substratum of which philosophy is created and conditioned, unfortunately, for the philosopher, for the rationalists at least, I mean, it's good for us because we can finally stop with this delusional nonsense that philosophy is created and conditioned, divorced from the psyche in some sort of psychological vacuum. It's nonsense. It's just not true. I mean, maybe it would be nice if it were true, but it's not. I don't know what to say. You know what I mean? I would like if cancer didn't exist. I would like if heroin didn't exist. It does. I don't know. You work with it, right? I remember as a rationalist, I did not like this because it undercuts this idea. By introducing subjectivity and psychological types, you kind of necessarily are undercutting the objectivity of your claims, right? This is what Nietzsche said, right? The truths that Kant arrived at were not actually truths. They were truths for Kant, which is to say, for someone of his particular psychological predisposition. You found irrational or rational truth because your mind privileges order. You're a rationalist, essentially. Your psyche is mostly intensified. A part of your psyche, a part of the collective unconscious is intensified more than the others, right? So the Romantics, their truth is true because the mythical structure is more intensified. It's an interesting thought. I think it's, it does sort of open the door to this sort of just regressive, irrational, pre-rational nonsense we see with the postmodernists. I think that's ridiculous. Why would you ever want to do that? But it's just my opinion, I guess. But so now we have another argument against traditional rationalist logic. Now we introduce the subjective psychological aspect in addition to all those other ones we talked about. Let's see what we got here. Consequently, the very structure of philosophy itself, its claim to exclusive validity, has been placed into question from the existentialist position of Jaspers. Position of Jaspers and Sartre, who both introduce psychological factors as opposed to Heidegger. And since philosophy is the preponderant expression of the mental structure, this has upset the exclusive validity and dominance of the mental structure itself. Just as the mental consciousness is here placed into question, or at least an attempt made to relativize it, so did Aristotle bring his irony to bear on the mythical consciousness of his day while himself consolidating the new mental consciousness. Irony always reveals the attempt to achieve detachment. In his Metaphysics, he speaks of the quote-unquote mythical embellishments used by the ancients to, quote, convince the masses to believe in certain entities. Absolute nonsense. So I think what Gebser's saying here is this attempt to either relativize or stamp out traditional rationality, which I think is probably unwise. It's one thing to bring it back into your little toolbox and employ it when you want. That's one thing, but stamp it out entirely stupid. But what he's doing is the same thing Aristotle did. When you take the mythical structure, and it's got all this awesome stuff, and it has all this great stuff, and it has this entire world onto itself, an entire way in which phenomenologically the world is reified, and it's completely dismissed and completely negated and completely diminished by just saying, oh, you just made it up so you can believe things. It's what the ridiculous atheist rationalists tell you. It's absolute nonsense. Oh, they just made stuff up so they can lie and convince you people to do what they want. Okay. I mean, I'm watching people die and sacrifice their religions, often irrationally. So I think it's a little more deep than that. I think these grand mythologies and the fact that people live their entire lives by them and they base their value system and all this stuff, I think it's a little deeper than just mythical embellishments. I don't think Aristotle's a moron. I just think that was stupid. The weakening of the exclusive validity and predominance of the mental structure is clearly expressed in the existentialist relationship to subject and object. Quote, all existentialists reject the differentiation between subject and object. You should. The subject, as we explained in quantum logic, the subject plays the decisive role in codifying and solidifying the ontology of the object in question. There is no subject versus object. Subject is integrated with the object and vice versa, if you want to call it that. So, yes, you should reject the subject-object dichotomy, at least to an extent. Reject the differentiation between subject and object and thereby devalue intellectual knowledge in philosophy. Okay, I'm not sure why that would necessarily devalue intellectual knowledge in philosophy. It seems to upgrade it, but okay. According to them, this isn't Gebser, but this is a quote. According to them, true knowledge is not gained by the intellect, but by the living experience with reality. And then this is Gebser. Yet it is precisely this emphasis on lived experience. Have you heard that before in the political sphere? You have to do what I say, essentially, because of my lived experience. I have a lived experience of racism, sexism, bigotry. So I'm just going to reorganize things, and you're going to go along with it. Precisely this emphasis on lived experience that exposes existentialism's false start towards superseding the object-subject dualism. Or, in Heidegger's words, quote, thinking begins when we have experienced that reason, which seemingly in this context is essentially just a synonym for rationality, glorified through the centuries, is the most obstinate adversary of thinking. Okay, first of all, based Heidegger, based. It is true that now deficient rationality is the biggest obstacle to a rational truth and clearings. Yes, that is true. That is based. Only the based ones understand this. I don't care if a bunch of midwit rationalists think that's ridiculous. I don't care. Number two, the existentialists. There's a big problem, they said. Think about what has been said here. According to them, true knowledge is not gained by the intellect, but by the living experience with reality. This is foolish. This is the exact same mistake rationalists make. They just go the other way, right? They say true knowledge does not come from lived experience. It comes from abstract conceptualization. That makes them a rationalist. You going the other way makes you a pre-rationalist. I have no need for pre-rationalists. If we're going to play this game of pre-rationalist, irrationalist, or rationalism, and you're going to force me to choose one of these three, I'm going to choose rationalist every time, because at least he can think. Again, for, the integral insight here, lived experience, as the existentialists want, should not be placed in opposition to the intellect. It should be placed in integration with the intellect. True knowledge in our sense now, in an irrational integral sense, comes from the integration of all these things, as it makes sense because they're all present in every moment of our lives. When you have knowledge, when you're in the world and you go to the grocery store, all of these faculties are being integrated and producing knowledge. They aren't happening separate from each other and isolated from each other. They inform each other. They create and condition each other. So why I would ever choose one or the other unless I'm actually providing a real reason for it? Silly, stupid. It's the same mistake rationalists make. They just go the other way. Don't ever let people tell you that we're just animals, we're just evolutionary organisms, and everything's kill or be killed, and all this crap where they reduce us to our pre-rational faculties and that. It's the exact same mistake rationalists make, just going the other way. It's ridiculous. Existentialism, this is Gebser, is not alone in discarding the purely rational and thus dualistic mode of thought. The same is true of the transcendental logic advanced primarily by by W. Szalasi, It too contains an aperspectival inception, possibly a decisive one. Szalasi, proceeds from the radical change of stance achieved by George Simmel, who wrote that, quote, transcendence is immanent in life. This signal insight was further heightened by Szalasi's differentiation between the concepts of quote-unquote transcendent and transcendental. Transcendental logic demonstrates the postulation of transcendence is no longer tenable or necessary. This consideration alone already manifests a supersession of dualism, since the immanent world, our so-called reality, is no longer opposed to an ultimately unattainable transcendent world. So essentially that's a fancy way of saying a just rationalist idea that the transcendent world, or transcendental, maybe I'm misunderstanding, whatever that spiritual other side is, if you will, however you want to describe it, it's separate, right? It's just like the rational, right? The rational one, two, separate, isolated, negate. So it's out there, separated and isolated, and it seemingly negates us insofar as we can't get to it, and the way it sort of affects our world is it's not as simple. It's not as complementary as people would normally believe. Essentially, according to Simon and Szilagyi, the transcendent and immanent are present together. All of immanent life is transcendence. It is a product of spiritual transcendence, and all, and the potential for changes spiritually in the world, which say, for example, mutations of new consciousness. Well, that happens imminently, which is, say, in this real world, which signals that the spirit is not only present, but efficacious. So that's another dualism being superseded, and I think it's an important one. And we're going to explain why in this next paragraph. Then we'll probably end it here. I'll probably finish out the rest of this. I'm going to try. I don't really see any reason why I wouldn't be able to do this tomorrow night, unless something crazy comes up. But we'll do one last paragraph. In philosophy, this transcendent world was the limit, or what we have called the perspectival point, because that's the vanishing point. If you watch my Kill Rationalism series, I talked about this. It's called Clarifying the Vanishing Point. I taught in my first, I believe it was episode 2 in that series, I talked about the open aspect of the vanishing point, right? What is that vanishing point? The point on the horizon line, where all the major lines in the frame meet. And in turn, that point confers order, clarity, and depth on sort of what follows from it. It structures what follows from it. Great, that's the open aspect. But of course, it closes as well. It's a simultaneous opening and closing. So the closing is, it limits every field. And if you want to hear more about that, I could go through very quickly every field and what each vanishing point limit that is present. Like, for example, history can never give you the origins of something, right? It can only give you like copies of it, which, you do the best with what you can. All thought only came as far as the limiting point where immanence turned into transcendence. Thus, the supersession of immanence was possible only through a metabolic attitude, a regression into the unperspectival, irrational world. As a result of Simon's formulation and Szilagyi's demonstration, which indicate that the transcendent is not a separate region of the world, but a transcendentality, yeah, there we go, an immanent power or possibility of being, that is indeed the basic possibility of our being as such, the perspectively fixed understanding of the world opens up, since now the irrelevant perspectival point is no longer there and hence need not be superseded or transcended. So pretty cool, huh? So once you integrate this stuff irrationally, you just kind of inherently supersede the vanishing point, the closed aspect, because each domain separately has a vanishing point, but when you integrate them, the vanishing point disappears because all of its weaknesses are compensated by the other fields, the other domains. So pretty cool. This was actually shorter than I thought it would be. I thought I'd finish this out, but it took a while. Tomorrow, I'll try to get you guys 2 this week. I don't really see a reason why I wouldn't be able to do this tomorrow night. We're going to talk about Heidegger, phenomenology, and Husserl next, or maybe tomorrow, I guess. I love you guys. You guys are the best, and I will see you soon. Thank you.